Hello and welcome to another LeetCode problem. Today we're going to be continuing on with a JavaScript challenge and we're going to be doing problem number 2628, JSON deep equal. So in this problem you're given two objects, O1 and O2, and you have to check if they're equal. And so for two objects to be deeply equal, they must contain the same keys and the associated values must be deeply equal. Two objects are also considered deeply equal if they pass the equal equality check. We may assume both objects are the output of JSON parse. In other words, they're valid JSON. Please solve it without using lodash is equal function. Okay, so let's take a look at the first example. So from the first example, we have an object. So it's going to be O1, and it's going to have two fields. So we're just going to draw it like this, representing an object. And it's going to have a field x equal to 1, field y equal to 2. And then we have O2, another object. And it's going to have field x equal to 1, y equal to 2. And so here the keys and values do match exactly. So there's an x key and a y key, and they match exactly. Okay. And in the second case, you have the same thing, but now the keys are reversed. So now there's a y here, and there's an x here. But even though the keys are reversed, it's still the same object. So as long as the keys match and the values match, the order doesn't matter. And you're not guaranteed order in a Python dictionary or a JavaScript object. So now let's take a look at the third example. So we have another object, O1, and now what do we have? So we have key x with a value null, and then we have key L with a value that's an array. And we have O2 with key x and a value null. And we have L, that's an array, but it's an array of strings, right? So 2, 3. Okay, and so these are not equal because an array of numbers is not equal to an array of strings. And so finally, the last example is we have true and false, and obviously true does not equal false. Okay, so let's get into it. So first of all, what is the 3 equals equality check, right? What does this mean? So the 3 equals equality check is if you have a number, let's write these things down. So if you have a number, okay, or you have it like a string, you have a Boolean, or you have a null. Let's just go over what it means for all these. Or we have undefined. Defined. Yeah, let's go over these first. So for a number, for a 3 equals equality check means that it's just a simple equals compared to a number, right? So if we have a number like 5 and we do a 3 equals, then the other thing has to be a 5 as well. It has to be a number 5 to be equal. For a string, same thing. It has to be a string, and the strings have to be equal. For Boolean, same thing. All these primitive types, it has to be a Boolean, and they have to be the same thing. For a null, the other thing has to be a null. For an undefined, the other thing has to be an undefined. So these are pretty straightforward. Now we have two more cases. We have an array. So for an array and an object, 3 equals means they have to point to the same place in memory. So you can have two arrays that are the same. So if you have something like x equals this, though, like 1, 2, 3, and y equals 1, 2, 3. These will not be equal because they point to a different place in memory. But in a deep equal, they should be equal because a deep equal means their values, like all these values, are the same. And so what we can do is we can simplify that a lot. So we can just perform this 3 equals to begin with. And then we know it can't be a number anymore. It can't be a string. It can't be a Boolean. It can't be an undefined. However, there is another thing, is a null in JavaScript is an object. And so because a null is an object, what we can actually do to make sure we don't have nulls, right? Like let's say we're given a null in an object. When we do this 3 equals, it's not going to be true, but we don't want nulls in it. Like once we did this 3 equals, the only way something can be equal to a null is if it's a null. So we can perform this 3 equals. Let's actually write down the steps here. Let's have this in red. So 1, let's perform this 3 equals. 2, we do have to check for nulls. check, because a null is an object. And so we don't want to, we're going to be checking for object types in the future, but we don't want nulls in there. So 2, we're going to check for nulls. If something is a null, that means that we don't want that, right? So that makes sense. Okay, now let's actually do some other stuff here. So we are going to check for the 3 equal. We are going to check for the null. What are we doing next? And if this passes, that means this is true. If one of these is a null, that means it's false, because the only way they could be equal is if you have 2 nulls, but then this would have passed. So this is true. This is false. If this passes. Now 3, we're actually going to compare for arrays. So there is a method to check for array type. So we're going to compare arrays. And the way we're going to do arrays is pretty straightforward. So for arrays, we're just going to check the length. And if the lengths are different, we're going to return false. So check length, right? So check length. Now, we also have to do one more thing. Actually, no. So for arrays, we just check length, and then we just check elements. So check elements. Elements. Okay, so that's what we have to do. But these elements can be like arrays in themselves as well, right? So you can have like 1, 2, and then you can have an array here. And so the way we're going to do the elements is we're actually going to do it recursively, where we're going to call this function again on each element. And then we're going to call the function again on each element. And then if those are equal, then that's fine. Now we have one more case, and that's object. However, there is something tricky here. So an array is an object. So array is an object in JavaScript. And so because we've already checked for arrays, like let's say one is an object and one is an array. When we do this array check, that's not going to pass. So when we do the object check, we also have to say if it's an object and it's not an array, because we have to check objects. If it's an object, if one's an object and one's an array, right, then they're obviously not going to be equal, right? So if we have an object, we have an array. If we don't check that there are arrays in here as well, so object and not array, because we don't want this case, right? We want only objects that are not arrays. But yeah, so for the object, it's going to be the same kind of thing as an array. We have to do a couple things. We have to check the length. So we have to check the length of the object. The way we could do that is using the keys. So if the lengths are different, then obviously the objects are not the same. And then we just go key by key, and we have to check we go key by key. So let's say we have 2 objects, right? And we have key A, B, C, and we have A, B, C in here. So we go key by key in object 1, check if that is in object 2, and if it is not, we can return false right away. Like if B was not in here, then obviously they're not the same. So we go key by key in object 1, check if it's in object 2, and then we have to compare that the values are the same also recursively, because the value could be something like an array, like in this example here, in this example 3. So when we check values of an array or an object, what we're going to actually do is we're going to do those recursively. Okay? And then because we check that the lengths are the same, if every single key in one is in the other, that means that the keys are exactly the same. That's why we've checked the lengths are the same first, because let's say this has A, B, C, D. If we didn't check the lengths, it'd be like, oh yeah, A is in there, B is in there, C is in there, but then we never check for this. So that's why you can check for the lengths first. Same thing for the array. You check for the lengths first. If they're not the same, obviously they're not equal, and then you just... So our recursive cases are going to be checking the values in the object and the actual values in the array. But that's pretty much going to be all the cases, right? So let's go over them again. So we're going to check for this equals thing. If that's true, then it says it passed the equality check, and so that's deeply equal. Now we're going to check for null values because we don't want to compare null to like an object. So if any one of those is null, we're going to do false. Then we're going to check for arrays. We're going to check the length, and we're going to check the elements recursively. And then finally, we're going to check for objects that aren't arrays because we don't want to compare an object to an array. And we're going to do the same thing. We're going to compare elements recursively. We're just going to check every key, make sure it's in the second one. Also check that the lengths are equal to begin with because the number of keys has to be the same. And then finally, we're going to compare the values recursively. Okay, so now we kind of know our strategy. So now we can write the code. So let's do that. So first of all, what's our first condition? So if O1 is strictly equals to O2, we can just return true straight away, right? Because that's what they said in this. They are deeply equal if they pass the equality check. That's going to help us get rid of, like the things that we went over, the strings, the numbers, the Booleans, all those like primitive types. But remember, we can still have a null. So we need to make sure that we don't have a null still. So we need to check for that. So if O1 equals null or O2 equals null, we need to return false, because if they were both null, it would have returned true here, but null is an object. So when we check for like object type, null is an object, and we don't want to compare nulls to objects because that wouldn't make any sense. They're never going to be equal. Okay, now our next case is the array case. And so in JavaScript, the way you can check if something is an array is use this method here. Array is array. So if the first thing is an array and the second thing is an array, is array O2. Now what are we doing? Remember, if the lengths are different, we can just return false here. So if O1.length does not equal O2.length, we can return false straight away. Okay, now we just have to loop through O1, and we have to compare to O2, but we're going to compare recursively. And now that we know the lengths are the same, we know that they're going to have the same amount of elements, so we don't have to worry about like one being longer than the other. So we'll just do a simple for loop. Plus. So we're going to do a recursive call here. So rdeeply equal, and we're going to call them both, right? So O1 at index I and O2 at index I. So if they're not equal, we can just return false straight away, because then these objects can't be equal. And then we have our final case. And so our final case is what, remember? So our final, or actually we forgot one thing. So if this does pass, we can return true here straight away, because that means that these arrays are equal. We've checked every single element. Okay. So now our final case is checking object types, and the way we can check for object types is we can actually say like type of O1 equals object. And remember, it can't be an array, so we have to do, so if type of O2 equals object, but they can't be arrays, because we don't want to compare an object to an array. Remember, that's what we're doing there. Type of, okay, so and array, let me actually just copy this. So and not array array, and not array array there. Okay, and let me actually clean this up a bit. So let's just put that here. Oh, what's going on? Okay, there we go. Okay, so let's look again at what we did. So we made sure that the type of O1 and O2 is an object, but neither of them is an array, right? We don't want to compare an object to an array. Okay. Now, what are we doing? So we can check the lengths, and if the number of keys are different, then we can obviously return false. And the way to do that is kind of like in Python. You can get the keys in each of them. So if object.keys of O1.length does not equal object.keys of O2.length, that means the number of keys are different, and so obviously they're not going to be equal, so we can return false straight away. Okay, now that we know the number of keys are the same, we just have to go through the keys in one of them and then compare the values. So we have to go through the keys in one of them, make sure they are in the second one. If they are, that means that all the keys are there, and then we have to compare the values recursively, right? Okay, so for, and we can just do a simple traversal. So for key in O1, we're going to go through all the keys. And so what are we doing? Right, so if the key is not in O2, so we could do like something like this, has own property. Essentially, this is saying, there's a bunch of ways you could do this, but essentially it's saying if this key is not in O2, then we can return false, because all the keys have to be the same. Now, if the keys do match, we have to actually check the values, and remember, we're going to check them recursively, and so that's going to be the case here, except a little bit different. So this is going to be key and key. So we're going to be checking the values recursively, because, like I said, the values can be something in like an array here, so you can't just like check them like this. So we're going to keep checking the values recursively, because these can be deeply nested. Okay, so if the keys are not, or sorry, if the values are not equal, we're going to return false. Okay, And now that we went through this entire object, let me just make sure here, this, yeah. So if we went through this entire object, we can return true because the objects are equal. And then finally, as a default base case, if none of this is true, we can return false. Why is it, let me see here. Is array. Okay, so I think this should just be lined up here to make it better. And this should have been like lined up over here, but to make it a little bit easier to see. Return true. Okay, I think that's good now. Yeah. Okay, so we have our base case false, and let's go over one more time what we actually did, right? So for all our primitive types and things like that, this is going to return true or false. So if the primitive types are not equal, it's just going to go through all of this and return the default false. If one of these is a null, we have to be returning false because, like I said, null is an object, and we don't want to compare nulls to objects. Arrays are also objects in JavaScript, so we are going to say if they are both arrays, let's compare every single element. And if they are all equal recursively, then let's return true. Now, if they are both objects but they're not arrays, because we don't want to compare an object to an array, let's go through the keys, make sure the keys are the same, and let's compare the values recursively. And then finally, we have the default base case where if any one of these earlier ones failed that we didn't return in, then we need to be returning false. So let's give that a try. Okay, nice. And so that did work. So hopefully you understood a little bit better of like what this means and what the types are in JavaScript. They're definitely kind of tricky and kind of weird. How like a null is an object, an array is an object, you know, definitely not super intuitive. So I would definitely encourage you to look into that if you still don't understand. But we are going to be doing a lot more JSON questions in the future, so it's going to make it a little bit more clear. We're going to be doing some of this again. All right, so if you like this video, please like it and subscribe to the channel. I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.